The day the gavel trembled, how Jasmine Crockett shattered the illusion of supreme authority. The marble halls of the United States Supreme Court had never witnessed anything like it. Chief Justice John Roberts, the unshakable steward of the nation's highest judicial body for nearly 2 decades, sat stunned and immobile behind the bench. Before him stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, delivering what constitutional scholars would later call the most searing legal takedown in modern American history. What was meant to be a routine judicial oversight hearing quickly spiraled into a constitutional reckoning. Crockett didn't just question the court's decisions, she obliterated its moral high ground. The moment she reached into her briefcase and retrieved a single, damning document, the atmosphere shifted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. And for the first time in his storied career, John Roberts, calm, calculating, revered, was silent. The fallout was immediate and unprecedented. By the end of the week, the Chief Justice was compelled to accept a $200 million settlement in a case that would expose a web of concealed conflicts and reshape the boundaries of judicial accountability. This is the extraordinary story of how a young congresswoman from Texas, armed with legal brilliance and moral clarity, brought America's most powerful legal institution to its knees and set in motion a movement that may redefine the very concept of judicial independence. An untouchable legacy meets its reckoning. Chief Justice Roberts had built his legacy on cautious conservatism, a Harvard pedigree, and years of carefully curated neutrality. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2005, Roberts had become a symbol of institutional stability, someone who could be counted on to navigate the court through national controversy with poise and restraint. He weathered storms over health care, voting rights, and reproductive freedom, often surprising critics with centrist positions. But beneath the polished surface, there were troubling signs. Legal analysts had long whispered about his consistent alignment with corporate interests and a series of financial disclosures that, while technically legal, hinted at deeper, ethically murky ties. Still, no one had connected the dots. Until Jasmine Crockett. The rise of a legal disruptor. Crockett, a fierce civil rights attorney from Texas, had never been one to accept the status quo. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she brought courtroom tenacity into the halls of Congress and quickly earned a reputation as one of the sharpest legal minds in the House. Unlike many of her colleagues, she didn't rely on staffers to script her interrogations. She crafted her own questions. She knew the Constitution inside and out. And when she stood at the mic, she didn't just speak, she prosecuted. Her constituents sent her to Washington with a mandate: hold power accountable, no matter where it hides. And when whispers began surfacing of judicial conflicts at the highest level, Crockett didn't hesitate. She saw the opportunity not just to expose corruption, but to confront the very myth of judicial invincibility. The case that changed everything. It began, ironically, with a voting rights dispute, a relatively routine appeal challenging restrictions that advocates claimed violated constitutional protections. The case was expected to move through normal channels with standard arguments and an anticipated ruling. But Crockett had other plans. Digging through records, she uncovered a paper trail that suggested a serious breach of judicial ethics. Hidden investments, private communications with lobbyists, and decisions that appeared to favor personal financial interests, all of it culminating in the document she revealed in open court. What happened next would send shockwaves through the legal world. Experts scrambled to analyze the implications. Law schools rewrote syllabi. Activists rallied. And Chief Justice Roberts, long seen as the embodiment of judicial decorum, was forced into an unprecedented public settlement. A new era of accountability in one moment of fearless truth-telling. Jasmine Crockett dismantled decades of myth-making. She proved that no institution, no matter how revered, is above the law. And in doing so, she reminded the nation of a fundamental democratic truth. Justice only holds power when it answers to the people. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a constitutional turning point. And it may be remembered as the day the Supreme Court was reminded that its authority comes not from tradition, but from trust. The moment the gavel shook, Jasmine Crockett's silent assault on the highest court while the nation watched with routine interest, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was playing a far longer game. Beneath the surface of procedural hearings and political posturing, she had been quietly building a case, one not aimed at passing legislation, but at exposing a rot festering within the very heart of the American judiciary. Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, had noticed patterns. Judicial decisions, particularly those authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, seemed to consistently favor particular financial interests. What others had dismissed as coincidence, she saw as correlation. Her legal instincts, honed through years of battling systemic injustice, told her there was something deeper, something structural. What she unearthed would become the foundation for a challenge so explosive, it threatened to destabilize the federal judiciary itself. If her evidence held, it wouldn't just tarnish reputations, it could delegitimize rulings that had shaped American law for over a decade. And at the center of that storm stood John Roberts. The confrontation began during what was supposed to be a benign congressional oversight hearing. Roberts had agreed to appear before the House Judiciary Committee to discuss court budgets and procedural operations, a standard engagement with minimal risk. He entered the chamber with confidence, accompanied by clerks and advisors, prepared to offer boilerplate responses and brief constitutional commentary. But Jasmine Crockett had orchestrated a very different kind of hearing. Seated strategically on the committee, she stayed silent as her colleagues asked predictable questions about caseloads and court efficiency. She, however, had no interest in paper trails or procedural statistics. She had come for something bigger. As the hearing progressed, Crockett calmly opened her notebook. Her first questions were deceptively ordinary, queries about judicial ethics, recusals, and conflict of interest guidelines. Roberts answered easily, reciting doctrine and precedent with the polish expected from a veteran jurist. But what he didn't realize was that every answer he gave was feeding into a meticulously laid trap. Crockett's line of questioning began to tighten. She shifted from general principles to specific cases, rulings Roberts himself had authored. She asked about his legal reasoning, about the factors considered in each decision. On the surface, the inquiries appeared academic, but legal observers in the room began to sense a deeper intent. She wasn't just referencing cases. She was connecting them. Piece by piece, Crockett exposed a pattern. Each ruling she brought up had benefited parties linked to certain industries, and, as she soon revealed, to Roberts's own undisclosed financial interests. Roberts's legendary calm began to waver. His responses grew guarded. He paused longer between words. Even members of the committee, initially distracted, began to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Then Crockett shifted gears, and the hearing transformed into history. Her next line of attack was surgical. She brought up Roberts's financial disclosures, the public documents that supposedly provided transparency into the holdings of the nation's top judge. At first, Roberts leaned on procedural defenses. He'd complied with disclosure requirements, followed ethics guidelines, and trusted internal oversight. But Crockett wasn't there to debate procedure. She was there to expose betrayal. She began citing specific investments, holdings that hadn't been disclosed or had been buried under broad categorizations. With each name and number, she showed direct overlaps between Roberts's private investments and litigants who had stood before the court and won. The timelines were chilling. Investment decisions closely followed by favorable rulings. Recurring financial ties to corporations that had benefited from majority opinions. For the first time in his career, the Chief Justice sat visibly shaken. By the end of the session, the courtroom was no longer a venue for oversight. It had become a battlefield. And Roberts, once thought untouchable, was the one on defense. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power of her argument lay in its precision. Years of preparation had culminated in a moment of undeniable clarity. And as she calmly laid out her evidence, timelines, names, transactions, the weight of it all crashed down on the court's once pristine image. The legal community would later call it one of the most consequential hearings in modern judicial history. Not because it exposed a single unethical act, but because it showed how deeply the rot had spread, and how convincingly it had been hidden under robes of prestige and protocol. As the hearing closed, Crockett's calm demeanor remained unshaken. She packed her notes, stood, and left the room, leaving behind a legacy in motion. John Roberts had walked into that chamber expecting to explain budget lines. Instead, he left with his reputation, and possibly the court's future, under serious threat. And for the American public watching, one thing became clear. Even the Supreme Court, shrouded in marble and tradition, must answer to truth when someone dares to speak it. The fall of the gavel, Jasmine Crockett's unrelenting prosecution of Chief Justice Roberts. What began as a routine congressional oversight hearing transformed into a legal earthquake that would shake the foundation of the American judiciary. Chief Justice John Roberts, long regarded as a paragon of constitutional intellect and ethical restraint, found himself on the defensive. Cornered by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in a confrontation that would become the defining legal spectacle of a generation. As Crockett pressed forward with her questioning, Roberts' confidence eroded visibly. His answers grew increasingly defensive than evasive. The polished composure he had spent years cultivating cracked under the weight of her scrutiny. Legal experts observing the exchange quickly understood what they were witnessing, not merely a hearing, but a masterclass in legal dismantling. The collapse of a legacy. Roberts attempted to guard his legacy by invoking judicial independence and the sacred principle of separation of powers. But instead of shielding him, his arguments revealed a deeper arrogance, an assumption that his position placed him beyond meaningful accountability. He chastised Crockett for what he called overreach, seemingly unaware or unwilling to admit that the woman questioning him possessed legal acumen equal to, if not exceeding, his own. Crockett's reply was swift, cool, and devastatingly precise. She reminded the chamber and the nation that judicial independence was never intended as a veil for unethical conduct or conflicts of interest. Her interpretation of constitutional ethics was so airtight, so grounded in precedent and principle, that even Republican committee members found themselves nodding in reluctant agreement. Roberts, once the unshakable symbol of judicial propriety, was unraveling in real time. The moment the room froze, then came the moment no one would forget. Without raising her voice, Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, an unassuming object that would bring the most powerful judge in the country to the brink of professional collapse. Inside was a forensic financial analysis prepared by independent accountants. The contents were damning. A detailed web of financial transactions tying Roberts to corporate entities with direct interests before the court. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, and complex instruments designed to obscure ownership were laid bare. The timing of Roberts's investments aligned with case outcomes too precisely to ignore. Gasps echoed through the hearing room. Roberts went pale. Evidence, unassailable and unforgiving case by case. Crockett walked the committee through rulings in which Roberts had cast deciding votes that directly benefited his own financial portfolio. Despite clear ethical requirements for recusal, he had never stepped aside. The pattern was consistent. The motive was clear. The defense was non-existent. When Roberts attempted to challenge the authenticity of the documents, Crockett calmly provided verification from multiple independent sources. When he insisted his conduct was legal, she countered with explicit violations of both federal ethics rules and constitutional obligations. The man who once authored landmark opinions in America's highest court suddenly found himself without words. His eloquence, so revered in oral arguments, deserted him. His silence, broadcast live across the country, spoke louder than any judgment. A turning point in judicial oversight. What followed was perhaps even more shocking. Crockett announced that this wasn't just a public reprimand. It was the beginning of formal consequences. She revealed that her investigation had uncovered clear violations of federal conflict of interest laws, some of which carried criminal penalties. Then came the final blow. She was preparing to file a civil lawsuit against Chief Justice Roberts seeking $200 million in damages for the harm caused by his decisions, the erosion of public trust, and the corruption of constitutional integrity. The claim would be pursued under provisions allowing the recovery of illicit gains and punitive damages in cases of betrayed public duty. From the gallery, members of Roberts's legal team sat in stunned silence. They knew the strength of her case. They knew what came next. Aftermath of a reckoning in a single hearing, Jasmine Crockett had not only exposed a sitting Chief Justice but also reignited the national debate over judicial ethics, oversight, and accountability. Her performance was not simply a political statement. It was a legal reckoning. And as the media, the public, and the political world replayed the moment she laid that folder on the table, one truth became undeniable. No title, no robe. No marble pillar can shield corruption from the power of a well-prepared argument backed by truth. The reckoning of a Chief Justice, Jasmine Crockett's final blow to judicial corruption. As the hearing reached its final hour, Chief Justice John Roberts' last line of defense unraveled completely. His attempts to dismiss the legal consequences as political overreach only underscored his desperation and his vulnerability. Claiming judicial immunity, he tried to shield himself behind legal tradition, but Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett dismantled that argument with precision. She calmly but firmly reminded the room that judicial independence does not grant immunity for acts of fraud, conspiracy, or betrayal of the public trust. Roberts' actions, she argued, had crossed the line from questionable ethics into outright criminality. A choice that would define a legacy in the hearing's climactic moments. Crockett made her final move. She presented Roberts with a stark ultimatum, one that would determine the fate of his legacy. He could quietly settle the matter by resigning from the Supreme Court and paying $200 million in damages, or he could face public trial, criminal prosecution, and the exposure of even more damning evidence. The proposed settlement wasn't a political stunt. It was a masterclass in legal engineering. It included strict financial monitoring, a public admission of misconduct, and full cooperation in broader investigations into judicial corruption. The offer was crafted not to destroy the court, but to protect its remaining integrity while ensuring Roberts could never again misuse his position. The collapse of power, broadcast live. Roberts' inability to refute the allegations or defend his conduct served as silent confirmation of everything Crockett had uncovered. His request for time to consider the settlement was seen for what it was, an acknowledgement of guilt and a last-ditch effort to preserve some semblance of dignity. The most powerful judge in America entered the hearing as an authority figure. He left as a man disgraced, trapped between financial ruin and total public humiliation. Within minutes, headlines exploded. Cable news broke into programming with special reports. Social media lit up with clips of Crockett's takedown. The hashtag Crockett exposes Roberts trended across platforms. Her calm, surgical presentation of financial evidence and Roberts' silent unraveling became instant cultural touchstones. Even longtime legal analysts were stunned. They admitted they had never seen a Chief Justice so thoroughly and publicly stripped of credibility. The earthquake that shook American democracy, the hearing's implications spread like wildfire. Networks ran wall-to-wall coverage. Constitutional scholars were summoned to explain the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. The consensus was clear. Crockett had not only held the most powerful judicial figure accountable, she had altered the balance of power between Congress and the court. Global media seized on the story. For many, it served as a rare example of democratic systems holding even their most protected institutions to account. Other nations watched in awe as one Congresswoman, armed with evidence and principle, forced the United States to confront the rot within its highest court. Domestically, the political aftershocks were immense. Democratic leaders immediately called for a full review of the entire federal judiciary to determine whether Roberts' misconduct was isolated or symptomatic of a wider ethical breakdown. Within the Republican Party, reactions were deeply divided. Some condemned Roberts and praised Crockett for her courage. Others deflected, minimized, or deflected blame. But the traditional conservative defense of unchecked judicial power clashed directly with the public's growing demand for accountability. Crockett's victory sparks a judicial revolution. Crockett's triumph wasn't just personal. It became a rallying cry for systemic reform. Her work sparked an unprecedented wave of investigations, ethics reviews, and proposed legislation. Activists across the country cited her as proof that no officeholder is immune to justice when the law is wielded with discipline and integrity. Public trust in the Supreme Court plummeted in the days following the hearing. Polls showed sharp declines in confidence toward federal judges and the judiciary as a whole. Americans expressed outrage that corruption had flourished so long, undetected and unpunished. Behind closed doors, Roberts' legal team scrambled. They knew the evidence was airtight. The prospect of a public trial was untenable. Facing a near-certain legal defeat and public destruction, they returned to the negotiating table. The terms of a historic fall. The final agreement was comprehensive and unforgiving. It required a $200 million payment reflecting both personal gains and institutional harm, immediate resignation from the Supreme Court, full cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into judicial misconduct. There would be no quiet exit, no sealed records, no protected legacy. Roberts would step down not as a steward of the law, but as a symbol of how unchecked power can corrupt even the highest institutions. Legacy of accountability. Jasmine Crockett's victory forced the most sweeping judicial reforms in American history. Congress began drafting new legislation to expand recusal standards, increase financial transparency, and create independent watchdog agencies to monitor judicial conduct. For generations, the judiciary had operated behind veils of tradition and assumed honor. Crockett tore that veil down, not to destroy the courts, but to save them from themselves. Her name will now be forever linked to a moment when truth pierced through power and the law served the people, not the privileged. The legacy of accountability, how Jasmine Crockett sparked a new era in American justice. The fallout from the Roberts scandal didn't just end with a resignation and a $200 million settlement. It launched a historic wave of reform that reshaped the judicial landscape of the United States. In response to the public's outrage and the overwhelming evidence Crockett had unveiled, Congress passed sweeping legislation to overhaul judicial oversight. The new laws established routine financial audits for federal judges, mandated the disclosure of all potential conflicts of interest, and introduced strict penalties for violations of judicial ethics. The reforms passed with rare bipartisan support, a testament to the growing consensus that the previous system had failed to safeguard the integrity of America's courts. A turning point in constitutional history. Legal scholars quickly labeled the Roberts case a turning point in U.S. constitutional law, comparable in impact to the Watergate scandal. Across the country, law schools began incorporating Crockett's methods into their coursework, treating her investigation as a model for effective legal accountability in democratic institutions. Internationally, the case was recognized as a powerful example of a democracy's ability to self-correct. Foreign observers praised the outcome as a sign that the U.S. Congress still possessed the will and the legal talent to confront corruption at the highest levels. Jasmine Crockett had not just exposed a corrupt judge. She had reaffirmed the strength of American oversight mechanisms in a moment when many feared they had grown toothless. Crockett's rise as a national force. The investigation's success catapulted Crockett into national prominence. Once regarded as a rising talent in the Democratic Party, she was now viewed as a transformative figure, someone with the intellect, grit, and courage to challenge even the most sacred institutions. Her peers in Congress began looking to her for guidance on oversight and reform. Legal organizations honored her with awards for her extraordinary service to the rule of law. Her precise, evidence-driven oversight tactics became the gold standard for future investigations, influencing how Congress approaches misconduct not just in the judiciary, but across all branches of government. Speculation quickly began to swirl about Crockett's future. Many saw her as a contender for higher office, or even a future judicial appointment. Her proven ability to confront entrenched power and win made her a compelling figure in a political landscape hungry for authenticity and reform. A symbol of what's possible. The story of Jasmine Crockett's pursuit of justice against Chief Justice John Roberts stands as more than just the downfall of one powerful man. It's a narrative of democratic resilience, a reminder that no individual, no matter how powerful, is immune from scrutiny when the truth is brought to light. Crockett's success underscored a critical truth. The strength of democracy lies not in the immunity of its institutions, but in their accountability. Her investigation proved that even the highest officeholders can, and must, answer for their actions when confronted by skilled legal minds committed to justice. Lasting reform restored trust. The reforms that followed Crockett's investigation have left an enduring mark. Judicial ethics laws were tightened. Oversight was strengthened. Public confidence, once shaken, began to rebuild. Americans could once again believe that justice wasn't just a word etched in marble, but a principle upheld through vigilance and action. Jasmine Crockett's work has become a case study in how personal resolve and professional discipline can ignite national change. Her courage, intellect, and unwavering commitment to truth have reshaped the boundaries of what congressional oversight can achieve. Be part of the change. If this story of legal brilliance and fearless accountability inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the political developments that continue to shape our democracy. Drop a comment below and tell us, what other cases of government misconduct deserve the same scrutiny Crockett brought to the Roberts case? Let this be a reminder: change is possible, but it takes bold voices, sharp minds, and unwavering courage to make it happen.